The turbulence started 20 minutes after takeoff. At first, it was nothing more than a slight jostling, the kind that makes your stomach roll and your drink ripple in its plastic cup. Passengers chuckled nervously, gripping armrests as the plane shook. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, just a bit of rough air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." I wasn't nervous. Not about the flight, at least. I had been on plenty of planes and turbulence never rattled me. I had other things to worry about. Like the girl in seat 23B. She was maybe 10 or 11 with tangled dark hair and a pale complexion. She hadn't spoken a word since I first boarded. Her mother, sitting beside her in 23A, was visibly distressed, gripping the girl's hand tightly while darting frantic glances in my direction. She had requested me specifically. Her whispered words before takeoff rang in my ears. "Father, something is wrong with her." I may have been wearing civilian clothes, but people like me have a way of being found. When you deal with the kind of evil I do, it leaves a mark. I'm not talking about scars or burns, though I have plenty of those. It's something deeper. The afflicted recognize me. Their demons do, too. And this girl had a demon. I was sure of it. She sat rigid, fingers digging into the armrests. Her lips moved slightly, whispering something too soft to hear. The mother's hand was clamped around hers, knuckles white. She looked at me, desperate. "Please, help her." I reached out, gently touching the girl's forehead. Her skin was ice cold. That was the first sign. The second came when her eyes flicked to mine, not with the gaze of a child, but something old, something knowing. And the corners of her lips curled up into the faintest of smirks. The plane jolted hard. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the overhead bins rattled. The seatbelt sign blinked on. Flight attendants hurried down the aisles, steadying themselves against seats, reassuring passengers that everything was fine. But it wasn't. Not at all. Because as the plane shuddered again, I heard it. A whisper slithering through the pressurized air like oil through water. It was coming from her. A low, rasping voice. "You shouldn't have come. I've faced many possessions in my time. I've seen the young and the old corrupted, their bodies twisted by forces beyond human comprehension. I know what it looks like when a demon is testing its limits, when it is playing. This one was playing." I kept my voice steady. "What is your name?" The mother shot me a confused glance. "Her name is Lily." "No," I said quietly. "I'm not talking to her." Lily turned her head toward me in a slow, unnatural motion. I caught my breath as I saw it, just for a moment, a flicker of something beneath her skin. A shifting, writhing movement as if something beneath her flesh was adjusting itself. "Names have power," I murmured. "Tell me yours." Lily's lips parted, and for a moment I thought she would answer. But then the turbulence hit hard. The plane dropped. Screams erupted as drinks flew into the air, oxygen masks trembled in their compartments, and passengers gripped their seats in terror. The plane rocked violently and a voice came over the intercom, thick with forced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are encountering unexpected weather conditions." I wasn't buying it. The pilot had no idea what he was dealing with. This wasn't weather. The lights flickered. Then Lily's seatbelt unlatched on its own. Before her mother could react, Lily floated. It was subtle at first. Her body lifted just an inch off the seat, her feet hovering above the floor. The mother gasped, reaching out to grab her daughter, but something held her back. Some invisible force pinned the mother against her seat. She clawed at her restraints, screaming. I acted fast. Pulling the vial of holy water from my pocket, I flicked a few drops toward Lily. The reaction was instant. She shrieked. Not a child's scream, something deeper, guttural, layered with a chorus of other voices. It wasn't just one demon inside her. It was many. The passengers nearest to us started turning, their eyes wide with horror. They could see it now. They could see her. Lily's limbs contorted, her fingers stretching unnaturally long. The skin around her mouth cracked as her smile widened far past the limits of human anatomy. Then, in a blur of movement, she turned to the seat behind her, row 24. A businessman sat there, gripping his armrest, his face frozen in terror. Lily lunged. Her small hands clamped onto his shoulders and his body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, mouth stretching in a silent scream. The lights flickered again and then a snap. His body convulsed once, then went still. Blood trickled from his nose and his mouth hung open. He was dead. Passengers were screaming now. Someone was shouting for a doctor. Another person was trying to unbuckle, desperate to get away. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped at 30,000 feet. Lily turned back to me, her mouth still too wide, too wrong. She tilted her head. That was fun. I had no choice now. I reached into my bag, pulling out my stolen airline blanket. It would have to do. In one swift motion, I wrapped it around her, pinning her arms, restraining her thrashing body as she screamed. The other passengers backed away. A flight attendant rushed forward, her eyes wide in panic. "Sir, what are you doing?" "Keeping us all alive," I said through gritted teeth. I pressed a hand to Lily's forehead, beginning the rite. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." She shrieked again, writhing in my grasp. The plane rocked violently as if the very air around us was protesting my words. The pressure inside the cabin shifted. Somewhere toward the front, someone started praying. Someone else was sobbing. "You cannot save her," the demon snarled. "She was promised to us." I didn't let up. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Lily arched her back, eyes rolling into her skull. The entire plane seemed to pulse, the walls groaning, the seats trembling. I pushed harder, pressing the cross pendant against her chest. Then, in an instant, the turbulence stopped. Everything went still. The lights steadied. The plane hummed with its usual mechanical drone. Lily collapsed into my arms, her body limp. Passengers were sobbing in relief. The mother reached forward, cradling her daughter as if she could somehow protect her from what had just happened. But I wasn't relieved. Because as I looked down at Lily's face, I saw something that made my blood run cold. She was still smiling. And in her small, childlike voice, she whispered that was just the beginning. The girl shouldn't have been conscious. I've dealt with countless possessions, but even the strongest of demons falter when met with the right prayers. Holy water burns them. The name of God rattles them. A true exorcism makes them scream. But this one was different. Lily's body lay limp in her mother's arms, but her lips curled ever so slightly. A whisper slid through the air, softer than the hum of the engines. "You are not ready." Then the lights cut out. A sharp inhale swept through the plane, hundreds of people gasping in collective terror. A child cried somewhere. The flight attendants shouted for calm, their voices shaking. I reached into my pocket, gripping the rosary beads I always carried. That was when the first scream erupted. Row 17. A man, mid-30s, leapt up from his seat, clawing at his throat. His face twisted in agony as he choked on something invisible. His wife scrambled beside him, shaking him, crying out for help. But there was nothing anyone could do, because his body was floating. His back arched unnaturally as he rose, higher and higher, until his head slammed into the overhead compartment with a sickening crack. And then the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just Lily anymore. Dozens of voices, low, guttural, ancient, filled the air, whispering in languages no human tongue should be able to speak. I grabbed my cross and stepped forward, but then the plane dropped. A stomach-lurching free fall sent passengers screaming, drinks flying, bodies slamming against seats. My legs buckled and I barely caught myself on an armrest. Overhead bins burst open, luggage spilling into the aisles. The man in row 17 hit the ceiling. His body slammed down into the aisle with a bone-shattering thud. Silence. Then, Lily opened her eyes. And they were black. Her mother whimpered, clutching her daughter close, tears streaming down her face. But Lily wasn't there anymore. Not really. She turned her head toward me with a slow, deliberate motion, her mouth stretching wider, her teeth too sharp. "You don't know what you've done." I felt it then. A shift in the air. A deep, suffocating pressure, as if the walls of reality itself were closing in. The other passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were changing. One by one, heads began to turn, eyes rolling back, lips parting in eerie, synchronized whispers. Every voice spoke as one. "This vessel is ours now." The possession wasn't just Lily's. It was spreading. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, weaving together in an unnatural chorus, voices overlapping like a wretched hymn. The possessed passengers rocked in their seats, eyes rolling, mouths parting to form words that didn't belong to them. I stepped forward, gripping my rosary, my fingers tightening around the cross. "In the name of Christ, I command you." Lily's body convulsed violently, and then she laughed. Not a child's laugh. Something deeper, throatier, like it was coming from a pit with no bottom. "You command nothing," she hissed, her voice layered with multiple tones, male and female, ancient and new. "You are nothing." The plane lurched again. Not from turbulence. From something else. Overhead compartments flung open one by one, spilling luggage into the aisles. A thick, oppressive pressure filled the cabin, pressing down on my chest. Around me, the possessed passengers began to rise from their seats, limbs moving unnaturally, heads snapping to odd angles. Then the dead man in row 17 sat up. His skull had caved in from the impact, his body should have been lifeless, but his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. His milky eyes locked onto mine, and in a brittle, rasping voice, he spoke. "Father, do you remember me?" I felt ice crawl up my spine. I had seen many things in my years of exorcisms, but I had never seen a demon reanimate the dead. His cracked lips trembled as if he were fighting to speak, and then he wheezed out, "She never forgave you. You left her to die." A cold wave of horror swept over me. "Maria." Lily giggled from her seat. "Would you like to see her again, Father?" "She's been waiting." She tilted her head. "We all have." The possessed passengers surged toward me. The plane lurched violently, sending passengers flying against their restraints. The overhead compartments burst fully open now, spilling luggage into the aisles. The emergency lights flickered, bathing the cabin in an eerie red glow. The possessed passengers were everywhere, crawling over seats, twisting their bodies in impossible angles, eyes black as voids. Their whispers turned to shrieks, layered voices screaming in languages long lost to time. I gritted my teeth, gripping my rosary tight as I pressed forward. A flight attendant, a young man, maybe mid-20s, was clutching a rosary of his own. He was crouched by an emergency exit, whispering frantic prayers under his breath. His eyes met mine, wide with terror. "What the hell is happening?" Before I could answer, the dead man lunged. I barely had time to react. His fingers wrapped around my throat, squeezing with unnatural strength. The stench of rotting flesh filled my nostrils. His mouth stretched open wider, far wider than any human should be able to, and from within, I heard the screams of something trapped. I slammed the crucifix against his forehead. His body convulsed, releasing me as he shrieked, the sound high-pitched and inhuman. Smoke sizzled from his flesh as he fell backward, writhing. But even as he burned, the other possessed laughed. Lily tilted her head. "That won't work forever." She was right. I could feel the exhaustion creeping in. My limbs were heavy, my breathing labored. I had fought demons before, but never like this, never so many at once. And the worst part? I could feel something watching us. Something outside the plane. The aircraft shuddered, not from turbulence, but from something pressing against it. The windows darkened as if something massive was flying beside us, blotting out the moonlight. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate knock against the fuselage. A sound that should have been impossible. A sound that sent a chill deep into my bones. The possessed passengers froze, their heads snapping toward the windows in unison. Their smiles vanished. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something in them that I hadn't expected. Fear. Lily's blackened eyes flickered toward me. "It's here." I swallowed hard. "What is?" She grinned. "The thing that owns us all." The knocking came again. Louder. Boom. 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 The entire plane shook with the force of it. A baby wailed somewhere in the back. A man cried out in terror. The flight attendant I had seen earlier was praying so fast his words blurred together. I forced myself to my feet. I had no idea what was coming. But I knew one thing. It wasn't just after the passengers anymore. It was after me. The third boom rattled the plane so violently that the oxygen masks deployed, dropping like limp nooses from the overhead compartments. The lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the faces of the possessed. And then, a crack. A long, jagged fracture split across one of the windows near row 14. The wind screamed through the cabin as air pressure shifted violently, sending papers, clothing, and loose objects flying toward the breach. A woman shrieked as her handbag was ripped from her lap, spiraling through the air. The possessed passengers all turned in unison, eyes locked on the spreading fracture. They weren't laughing anymore. I staggered forward, gripping the back of a seat to keep from being pulled toward the breach. My mind raced. If the window gave out completely, the sudden decompression could rip part of the fuselage apart. And then we'd all be dead. I turned to the terrified flight attendant near the exit. "We need to reinforce that window. Now." But before he could move, Lily stood up. She wasn't being pulled by the suction. She wasn't struggling to keep her balance. She simply rose as if gravity had no hold on her. Her tiny hands lifted toward the broken window, fingers twisting into unnatural shapes. Her mouth opened wider. Too wide, and she began to chant. The language wasn't Latin. It wasn't anything human. The air around her rippled, distorting like heat waves. A low hum vibrated through the cabin, rattling the seats and causing several passengers to clutch their ears in pain. The crack in the window stopped spreading, but the knocking continued. Boom, boom, boom. Something wanted in, and Lily was trying to let it in. I couldn't let that happen. Summoning every ounce of strength left in my body, I lunged toward her, raising my crucifix high. "In the name of the Almighty, I cast you out." Her head snapped toward me. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind those blackened eyes. Amusement, and then pity. She whispered something under her breath. A single word, lost beneath the howling wind. And then the window exploded. A deafening roar filled the cabin as everything ripped toward the gaping hole. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks flailed wildly in the chaos. The suction was immense, yanking loose objects, trays, even pieces of luggage toward the breach. I barely had time to react before I felt my own feet lift off the ground. I grabbed onto the closest seat, my fingers slipping against the fabric as the pressure tried to pull me toward the gaping void. The flight attendant wasn't as lucky. He let out one final scream before he was sucked out of the plane. His body vanished into the endless night. Gone. I gritted my teeth, muscles straining as I held on. The wind roared in my ears, drowning out every other sound. My cross dangled from my neck, whipping against my chest. Lily just watched me, unmoved, unbothered. And then, in a voice far too soft for the chaos around us, she whispered, "It's here." And I felt it. Something huge. Something outside the plane. Something looking in. I forced myself to look. Through the shattered window, beyond the howling void of the night sky, something was moving. A shape too vast to comprehend. It wasn't just large, it was impossible. My mind strained to grasp its form, but it refused to be fully seen, as if my human perception wasn't equipped to understand it. I caught glimpses, a mass of shifting limbs, too many and not enough. Eyes that weren't eyes, but voids that drank in all light. Wings that stretched too far, disappearing into the darkness. A mouth, or was it mouths? Lined with writhing, black tendrils. It wasn't just outside the plane. It was wrapped around it. The fuselage groaned as the thing tightened its grip, metal warping like crumpled paper. The aircraft shuddered violently, alarms blaring from the cockpit. Somewhere, a pilot was screaming into the radio, but I knew we were alone up here. No one was coming to save us. Lily smiled. She lifted a single hand toward the gaping hole in the plane, her fingers spreading wide in invitation. She was letting it in. No, I didn't think. I acted. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at Lily, slamming the silver crucifix against her forehead. A sound like shattering glass filled the cabin. Lily's body arched, her back bending at an impossible angle. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as the blackness in her eyes cracked, like a mirror breaking from the inside. The other possessed passengers shrieked in unison. The pressure inside the plane shifted. The presence outside let out a deafening, otherworldly roar. A sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating in my bones. The windows cracked, but the thing didn't come inside. It was being pushed back. Lily convulsed violently, clawing at the crucifix pressed against her forehead. "No, you don't understand." I pushed harder, forcing the prayer through my shaking lips. "The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you." The thing outside screamed. The shadows within Lily shattered, and then she collapsed. The moment she hit the floor, a shockwave blasted through the plane. The possessed passengers dropped, their bodies slack, mouths hanging open. The unnatural darkness fled from their eyes, leaving only confusion and horror in its wake. The thing outside released the plane. The fuselage lurched as we stabilized, the wind still howling through the gaping hole where the window had been. But the presence was gone. We were falling. The pilots were shouting, struggling for control. The aircraft tilted violently, warning lights flashing red. Oxygen masks flailed in the air, passengers gasping for breath. I staggered to my feet, grabbing Lily's small, unconscious body. Her mother, pale, shaking, rushed to my side, clutching her daughter with trembling hands. She's breathing," the woman sobbed, pressing Lily's face against her chest. Oh God, she's alive." I didn't have time to comfort her. I forced my way toward the cockpit, nearly falling as the plane jolted again. The pilots were fighting to keep us in the air. The radio was dead. I grabbed the captain by the shoulder. "Can you land this thing?" His face was drenched in sweat. He swallowed hard. "I don't know." The altimeter was spinning wildly. We were still falling. I grabbed the intercom and spoke to the passengers. My voice was hoarse, raw. "Brace yourselves." A woman sobbed. A man whispered a prayer. Someone held a child close. I looked out the window. The ground was rushing toward us. Impact was inevitable. And then, everything went black. Part 5, The Descent. Darkness swallowed me whole. There was no impact, no sudden pain, just an all-consuming void, pressing in on all sides. I was falling, but there was no end, no ground to meet me. And then, I woke up. The roar of wind still filled my ears. The plane was still falling. Alarms shrieked, warning lights flashing across the cabin. The pressure had stabilized just enough to keep the aircraft from being torn apart. But the damage was done. The pilots were still fighting for control, but their voices were drowned beneath the chaos. Lily was gone. Her mother was still clutching her unconscious body, rocking back and forth, whispering desperate prayers. But whatever had been inside her daughter, it wasn't just lurking anymore. It was everywhere. The possessed passengers were convulsing, their bodies twitching violently as their mouths stretched open. Their screams weren't human. The cabin shook as their voices blended into one monstrous, overlapping howl. And then, the lights flickered out. Total blackness. And I knew we weren't in the sky anymore. We were somewhere else. For a moment, the world was nothing. No sound, no light, just an empty void, stretching forever. Couldn't even feel my body. Had we crashed? Had we died? No. I could still hear the faint, ragged sound of my breathing. I could feel the weight of the crucifix in my palm, the cold metal grounding me in reality. And then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the plane came back. The emergency lights flashed, bathing the cabin in a deep, hellish red. The possessed passengers were still writhing in their seats, their mouths stretched wide. But now there was something else. Presence. It was here. I turned slowly, instinctively, toward the shattered window, and I saw it. The thing from before, the impossible entity that had gripped the plane, was no longer outside. It was inside. Its massive form coiled through the cabin like a living shadow, slipping between seats, weaving through the terrified, unpossessed passengers. His body wasn't solid, shifting between smoke and flesh, its shape ever-changing. And it was looking at me. A jagged grin split across its face, or what I assumed was its face. Rows of teeth, layered like a shark's, stretched into an impossible smile. And then it spoke. Not with words, with thoughts. "You cannot save them." I felt the voice inside my head, pressing against my skull like 1,000 whispering mouths. I clenched my jaw, gripping my rosary so tightly the beads dug into my palm. "You have no power here," I said. The thing laughed, not the way a human laughs. It was every laugh, every voice, every chuckle, every cackle and giggle and wheeze, all mashed together into a horrible, deafening noise that shook the entire plane. And then, the lights went out again, and something grabbed me. The thing grabbed me, its fingers like jagged bone beneath stretched, decayed flesh. Cold seeped into my skin, deeper than temperature. This was something else, something that crawled through my veins and gnawed at my very soul. My breath hitched, my body frozen, and for a split second, I felt it trying to pull me out of myself. I'd encountered demons before, but this was no ordinary possession. This thing didn't just want control. It wanted to consume. I fought back with the only thing I had. I forced a prayer from my lips, the words trembling but resolute. "Deliver us from evil." The grip loosened. The thing hissed, recoiling as if burned. I staggered backward, my vision swimming. The red emergency lights flickered just long enough for me to see it. It wasn't just one entity. It was many, all fused together in a shifting, writhing mass. Hands emerged and sank back into its ever-changing form. Faces, twisted in agony, pushed to the surface before being swallowed again. And at the center of it all, Lily. She was floating inside the creature's core, her body limp, her head lolling to one side. Her lips moved. I couldn't hear her over the roar of the wind and the wailing of the possessed passengers, but I could see the words form on her cracked lips. Help me. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't leaving her behind. I lunged forward, gripping my cross tight, and swung it straight into the creature's mass. The screech that erupted nearly shattered my eardrums. The force of it sent me flying backward, slamming into a row of seats. Pain shot through my ribs, but I forced myself up. The thing was writhing, its form distorting, pulling inward on itself. The passengers around me convulsed violently, their bodies twitching in unnatural spasms. And then, the plane jolted. We were falling faster. A crackling voice burst over the intercom. Mayday! Mayday! We have lost control. We are static. I turned back to the creature, ignoring the searing pain in my side. The exorcism had weakened it, but it wasn't gone. I had one last chance. I pressed my forehead to the cross and whispered, Lord, give me strength. Then I charged. I charged at the thing, my cross held high, every muscle in my body screaming. The creature's mass shifted, faces stretching and contorting within its swirling form. Some were weeping. Some were screaming. Others just watched, hollow and empty, as if their souls had already been devoured. And at its center, Lily. I had to get her out. I drove the crucifix forward, plunging it straight into the core of the writhing abomination. A sound like thunder cracking the sky erupted. The entity shrieked, its body convulsing, tendrils of darkness unraveling into streams of smoke. Passengers who had been possessed let out howls of agony, their bodies arching violently before slumping over in their seats, unconscious. The creature was dying, but it wasn't going alone. The plane tilted sharply to the right, throwing me sideways. A blaring alarm shrieked from the cockpit and the intercom crackled with panicked voices. We're losing altitude. Brace for impact. Lily's eyes snapped open. For a moment, they were black, a remnant of the thing's control. But then, with a shuddering gasp, she took a breath. Her mother's scream cut through the chaos. Lily! Oh God, Lily! I grabbed her. She was small, fragile, but warm, alive. Her pulse was faint, but steady. But there was no time to celebrate. The plane was going down. Over the intercom, a voice cracked through the static. Mayday! Mayday! We are silence. Then, impact. A deafening, world-ending crash. The sensation of being ripped apart. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to silence. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was alive. My body ached, my skin was cold, and my mind felt like it had been thrown through a blender. I forced myself to breathe a short, shallow gasps, testing for pain. Everything hurt, but I was still here. I opened my eyes. Wreckage surrounded me. The plane had crashed. The fuselage was split open like a gutted fish, pieces of metal jutting out at unnatural angles. Smoke drifted through the torn remains of the cabin, curling upward into the dark sky. Fires burned in patches, flickering against the twisted steel. And then the smell. Blood. Burnt flesh. Death. I swallowed hard, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. How many survived? I pushed myself upright, pain lancing through my ribs. A deep gash ran along my forearm, but it wasn't fatal. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move. I had to find the others. Had to find Lily. Had to find out if we were alone out here. Then, from somewhere in the wreckage, a whisper. Something was still here. I froze. The whisper drifted through the wreckage like smoke, curling around me in the cold night air. It wasn't coming from one place, it was everywhere, slipping between the twisted metal and shattered seats. I turned, scanning the ruins of the plane. Bodies were strewn across the ground, some still strapped into their seats, others flung far from the wreckage. Some were groaning, alive but wounded. But most were silent. I forced my legs to move. One step, then another. Every inch of me screamed in protest, but I ignored it. I had to find her. Lily. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. I stumbled over a broken seat, catching myself against a mangled section of the fuselage. Smoke stung my eyes. Then, a gasp. Not far. I pushed forward, weaving between the wreckage until I found her. Lily lay crumpled near a row of torn seats, her mother beside her, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. But she was alive, her chest rose and fell in uneven, shallow breaths. I dropped to my knees beside them. Lily? Her mother stirred, blinking up at me with wide, dazed eyes. She's breathing, she whispered. The whisper came again. Closer. I turned sharply, my heart hammering. The firelight cast long, twisting shadows across the ruins of the plane. The air felt thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the wreckage. Unmoving. Watching. It wasn't human. And it wasn't alone. Shapes began to shift in the darkness beyond the wreckage, emerging from the tree line. Tall, twisted figures, their eyes reflecting the flames. The crash didn't kill us all, but we weren't safe. Not even close. The figures in the darkness moved. Not like people. Not like anything that belonged in this world. Their bodies stretched unnaturally, limbs too long, spines bending at impossible angles. Their heads tilted, mouths opening just slightly, wide enough to see the teeth. Rows and rows of teeth. The whispering grew louder. Lily stirred beside me, letting out a weak whimper. Her mother tightened her grip on her, pulling the child closer. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my crucifix, forcing my shaking fingers to wrap around it. The figures stopped. They stood there, just outside the glow of the wreckage flames, watching. And then one of them spoke, not with a mouth, with a voice inside my head. You brought her back. The air left my lungs. Lily, they weren't after the wreckage. They weren't after the other survivors. They were after her. The mother sobbed, rocking her daughter in her arms. Please, she gasped, looking up at me. What do we do? I didn't know, but I knew one thing. We had to run. I grabbed Lily's mother by the arm, yanking her up. We need to move. Now. She was still dazed, blinking as if her brain hadn't caught up with reality. But the whispering was getting louder. The figures at the edge of the wreckage weren't staying still anymore. They were drifting closer, their movements wrong, jerky, like broken puppets being pulled by invisible strings. I didn't wait. I hauled Lily into my arms, ignoring the searing pain in my ribs, and started running. Lily's mother stumbled at first, but her survival instincts kicked in, and she kept pace beside me. Behind us, the whispering turned into shrieks. I glanced back and regretted it instantly. The things were coming after us, moving impossibly fast, their bodies lurching forward in unnatural bursts, covering far too much ground in seconds. One of them crawled over the wreckage on all fours, its elongated fingers scraping against the metal, its head twisting upside down as it watched us. I ran faster. The remaining survivors were just starting to stir, some groaning, others calling out weakly for help. I wanted to save them, but if I stopped now, we would all die. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense. It wasn't safe, but it was better than out here in the open. Then, a scream tore through the night. One of the passengers, the businessman from before, wasn't fast enough. Something grabbed him. I saw the shadows twist around him, long fingers closing over his head. His scream cut off instantly, replaced by the sickening sound of bones snapping. His body collapsed inward, folding unnaturally before being dragged into the darkness. Gone. I kept running. The trees swallowed us whole. And then, suddenly, silence. I stopped, chest heaving. Lily's mother collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. No more whispering. No more chasing. Had we lost them? I held my breath, listened. Nothing. Then, a hand landed on my shoulder. I spun around and came face to face with something that should not exist. I barely had time to react. The hand on my shoulder wasn't human. It felt wrong. Too many fingers, the texture like wet stone, impossibly cold. My entire body seized with pure, animal terror as I turned to face it. The figure loomed over me, its face just inches from mine. No eyes, no nose, just a mouth, stretched wide in a grotesque, unnatural grin. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just watched me. The air felt thick, pressing in on my skull, making it hard to think. My grip tightened around the crucifix. And then, it spoke. She does not belong here. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It echoed inside my skull, like a thought that wasn't mine. My stomach turned to ice. I knew who they were talking about. Lily. I took a slow step back, trying not to collapse. She's just a child. The thing tilted its head, the motion jagged, as if its neck was splintering in the process. She was promised to us. The forest around me shifted. Shadows curled and writhed, forming more figures, all identical, all grinning. Lily stirred in my arms. She whimpered in her sleep, as if she could feel their presence. The largest figure leaned in closer, its mouth now inches from my ear. "Give her to us." I clenched my jaw. And then I did something that might have doomed us all. I whispered, "No." The air split apart. The whispering returned, no longer soft but deafening. A chorus of voices screaming from every direction. The trees trembled. The ground beneath us seemed to pulse as if alive. And then they moved, all at once. Hundreds of hands reached for us. I ran. Branches whipped past me, slashing at my skin. Lily's mother was right behind me, sobbing, her breaths coming out in ragged gasps. The whispering followed us, growing louder, crawling into my skull, threatening to pull me under. Then, a light, a fire burning ahead of us, flickering through the trees. Hope. I sprinted toward it, lungs screaming, legs nearly giving out. And then, we broke through the trees, straight into something worse. We weren't alone. A town lay before us, nestled deep in the forest. But something was wrong. The streets were empty. The houses were watching. And then, from the rooftops, the whispering started again. We had escaped the wreckage, but we had run straight into something else entirely. Something worse. Something waiting for us. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind you find in nature. The peaceful hush of the wind through trees. The distant call of an animal. This was dead silence. A silence that listened. The town stretched before us, hidden deep in the forest, its streets eerily still. The houses were old, wooden structures with darkened windows and doors that seemed just slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to step inside. No lights, no movement, just the feeling that we were being watched. Lily stirred in my arms, whimpering in her sleep. Her mother clung to me, trembling, her fingers digging into my arm. "Where are we?" she whispered. I didn't know, but I did know one thing. We weren't safe. And then, from somewhere deep in the town, a single door creaked open. The whispering had found us again. The door swung open slowly, revealing only darkness beyond the threshold. No figure stood in the doorway. No voice called out. Just that whispering, curling through the night like a sickly breeze. Lily shuddered in my arms. Her mother squeezed my arm tighter. "We can't stay here," she breathed. "We have to keep moving." I agreed. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run. But where? The forest was behind us, filled with those things, the ones that had been waiting for Lily. The town was in front of us, silent and wrong, its buildings standing like graves. And beyond that, I had no idea. Lily let out a small, pained moan. We didn't have a choice. I turned toward the closest building, an old two-story wooden house with its door slightly ajar. If something was watching us, we needed cover. "Inside," I said. Lily's mother hesitated, but when another door creaked open, farther down the street, she moved. We hurried inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The outside world fell away, and suddenly, it was too quiet, the silence pressing down on us like a thick fog. I set Lily down gently against the floorboards, her mother kneeling beside her, checking her pulse. "She's still breathing," she whispered, "but she's burning up." I looked around. The house was empty. No furniture, no pictures on the walls, just a long hallway leading deeper inside, where a staircase disappeared into darkness. And yet, felt lived in, like someone had been here just moments before we arrived. Then I noticed the footprints in the dust, leading upstairs, and from above us, a single thump. Someone or something was here with us. The thump came again, slow, deliberate, not the sound of an animal or a house settling. Someone was up there. Lily's mother gripped my arm. "We should leave," she whispered. I wanted to agree, but outside, in the streets, the whispering still lingered. I could feel it, pressing against the walls of the house, slipping through the cracks in the wood, waiting for us to step back out. We had no good options. Another thump, then footsteps, slow, dragging steps moving toward the top of the staircase. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. My hand tightened around my crucifix. "Who's there?" No answer. just breathing. Shallow. Wrong. Lily stirred on the floor, letting out a faint whimper. Her mother hushed her, brushing the sweat-drenched hair from her face. The footsteps stopped. Then, a voice. It didn't come from the stairs. Came from everywhere. You shouldn't have brought her here. My blood turned to ice. I took a slow step toward the staircase. The shadows at the top of the stairs shifted. Something was waiting. And then, the first step creaked as it moved down toward us. The first step groaned under its weight. Then another, and another. The sound was wrong. Like something moving in a body that wasn't built to walk, like bones bending the way they shouldn't. I gripped my cross tighter, stepping in front of Lily and her mother. My heart pounded against my ribs. From the top of the stairs, it emerged. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, its arms too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over sharp bones. But its face, it didn't have one. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, empty surface where a face should have been. And yet, I knew it was looking at me. I felt its gaze, burning into my skull, pressing into my thoughts like it was inside my head. Lily whimpered behind me. The thing twitched at the sound. Then it moved, not walking, gliding, straight down the stairs, straight toward us. I raised the cross. In the name of Christ. It vanished. One moment it was there, the next gone, like it had melted into the darkness itself. The air shifted. The whispering outside stopped. Silence. And then, from behind me, a breath, right at my ear. She is ours. I spun around, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed us whole. Couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The air was thick, pressing against my chest as if something unseen was wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the void. Lily's mother screamed. I reached out blindly, grabbing at nothing. The cross in my hand burned cold, almost vibrating. Then a sound. Footsteps. Not from the stairs this time. From everywhere. The house creaked, the walls shifting like a living thing. The floorboards beneath us shuddered, groaning under the weight of something I couldn't see. Then, a voice. You should not have come here. The sound slithered through my skull, filling my mind with something old, something hungry. And suddenly, I could see. Not with my eyes. With my mind. The darkness around me was moving. Shadows curled in the corners of the room, twisting together into figures, watching us. Their mouths didn't move, but I felt them whispering. And I knew it. We were never meant to leave this town. Then, Lily screamed. I spun toward her, but she wasn't on the floor anymore. She was floating. Her body rose into the air, her limbs limp, her head tilted back, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. The whispering grew frantic, the shadows reaching for her, wrapping around her small frame like smoke. They were taking her back. I didn't think. I lunged forward, grabbing her hand, yanking her down with all my strength. The shadows fought me, pulling back, clawing at my skin with unseen fingers. My head pounded, my vision swam. And then, I spoke his name. Lily fell into my arms. The whispering stopped. The darkness vanished. For a moment, silence. Then, a door creaked open somewhere in the house. And I knew it. The town wasn't finished with us yet. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate. A long, empty hallway stretched beyond it, disappearing into darkness. The house was changing. I knew deep in my bones that this wasn't the same house we had entered. The walls breathed, shifting like lungs, inhaling and exhaling. The air was thick, damp, waiting. Lily was still in my arms, her small body shivering violently. Her mother clutched my arm, shaking her head, tears streaking down her face. We can't stay here. She was right, but I had no idea where to go. The town outside was wrong. The house inside was alive. And the whispering? It had started again. This time it was closer. I turned toward the hallway. We had no choice. We had to move forward. And so we stepped inside. And the door slammed shut behind us. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the house like a gunshot. Lily's mother gasped, whirling around to grab the handle, but there was no door anymore. Just a wall. Smooth, featureless wood, as if an exit had never existed. Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. Think. Focus. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long. The flickering light overhead buzzed, casting deep shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Then footsteps. Not ours. Something was ahead of us. Lily whimpered in my arms, her feverish body trembling. Her mother pressed closer, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. I whispered, "Stay close." And we walked forward. The whispering around us grew louder. The walls pulsed. And then, from deep in the hallway, a voice. "We see you." The light flickered out. We were not alone in the dark. The darkness was absolute. I reached out blindly, feeling the rough texture of the walls beneath my fingertips. The wood was warm, almost pulsing, like something was breathing just beneath the surface. Lily's mother let out a shaky breath. Where are we?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. A soft scuffling sound came from ahead. Something moving. Lily stirred in my arms. Her body felt even hotter, burning up with fever. Then, from the shadows, a hand shot out. Gray. Twisted. Wrong. It grabbed my wrist. I yelled, stumbling backward, nearly dropping Lily. The thing lurched out of the dark, a figure, tall and skeletal, its face a gaping, hollow void. I raised the crucifix. In the name of it. The thing hissed and vanished, dissolving into black smoke. The whispering around us grew frantic. And then a door appeared ahead of us. Slightly open. Waiting. I didn't hesitate. We ran toward it. And the moment we crossed the threshold, the ground collapsed beneath us. We were falling. And the darkness swallowed us whole. We plunged into the abyss. Wind howled past my ears, but I couldn't see anything, just endless blackness stretching in every direction. My stomach twisted as gravity yanked me downward. Lily still clutched tightly in my arms. I heard her mother screaming, but I couldn't see her. We were separated. And then impact. I hit the ground hard, the force knocking the air from my lungs. Pain exploded through my side, but I didn't let go of Lily. For a moment, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Then, whispers. I forced my eyes open. I was somewhere else. The ground beneath me wasn't wooden floorboards anymore. It was cold, damp stone. The air smelled of earth, of something ancient and rotting. A basement? A tunnel? No. A catacomb. Lining the walls were figures standing motionless. Not statues. Bodies. Some were skeletal, long decayed. Others looked fresh, their skin pale and waxy, their eyes sewn shut. And yet, I felt them watching me. I struggled to my feet, clutching Lily against my chest. My head throbbed, my body aching from the fall. Lily's mother? I called out, my voice hoarse. Silence. Then, a low scraping sound echoed through the catacombs. One of the figures had moved. And then another. The corpses lining the walls began to turn their heads toward me, their mouths stretching open. And the whispering returned. From behind me, a voice rasped. You don't belong here. The corpses stepped forward. Their movements were slow but unnatural, jerky, as if they had forgotten how to walk. Their stitched eyes twitched, their mouths gaping in silent moans. I backed away, holding Lily tighter. My pulse hammered in my skull. I needed to run. But where? The catacombs stretched in both directions, fading into blackness. The walls pulsed, damp with something that breathed. Then, one of the corpses spoke. Give her back. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from all of them at once. Lily stirred, her small hands clutching my shirt. Her feverish body shuddered violently. The whispering grew louder. The corpses surged toward me, their skeletal fingers outstretched. I ran. Dodging between the dead, I sprinted down the narrow passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My feet pounded against the stone, the air thick with decay. The dead followed. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps slapping wetly against the floor, their limbs cracking as they moved too fast for bodies that should not walk. Ahead, a door. Massive. Old. Covered in symbols I didn't recognize. I didn't stop. I slammed into it, my free hand grasping the rusted handle, wrenching it open. The whispering became a scream. And I fell through. The door slammed shut behind me. Silence. I turned. I was in a church. But something was wrong. The pews were filled with figures, their heads bowed. The air was thick with the scent of wax and rot. Candles flickered in the dim light. And at the altar, a priest stood waiting. His face was missing. And he spoke without a mouth. You cannot run from God. The priest took a step forward. His body moved naturally, but his face, his lack of a face, made my stomach churn. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale flesh like wax melted over bone. And yet I could hear him. You cannot run from God. His voice wasn't coming from his body. It echoed inside my skull, pressing against my thoughts like an iron weight. I tightened my grip on Lily. She was still burning up, her tiny body trembling. Her mother was nowhere to be seen. The pews around me were filled with motionless figures, their heads bowed in prayer. And then, all at once, they turned toward me. Their movements were slow, synchronized, and their faces were just like the priest's, blank, featureless flesh, smooth and unnatural. The whispering returned, filling the church, coming from everywhere at once. I stepped back toward the door. It was gone. The priest raised a hand. Kneel. And the congregation stood up at the same time. Hundreds of them. Moving toward me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The faceless priest towered over me, his outstretched hand trembling as if barely containing something writhing beneath his skin. Behind him, the congregation advanced, their featureless heads tilting at unnatural angles. Kneel, the priest said again. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The air in the church grew thick, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My knees buckled, the unseen force dragging me downward. I gritted my teeth, trying to resist. I had seen demons before. I had fought them, cast them out, stood my ground against the damned. But this was different. This wasn't possession. This was worship. And it wanted me to submit. Lily whimpered in my arms, her small hands clutching at my shirt. Her feverish breath was hot against my neck. I had to fight. I clenched my crucifix in my fist, raising it toward the priest. My voice was hoarse, shaking, but I forced the words out. The Lord is my shepherd. The congregation screamed. Not in pain. In rage. Their heads snapped back, their bodies convulsing as the church walls shook. The priest lurched forward, moving faster than anything that size should. His hand gripped my throat. And suddenly, I wasn't in the church anymore. The world vanished. 1 second I was in the church, the priest's grip burning against my throat. And the next I was somewhere else. A place of endless black. There was no sky. No ground. Just emptiness. Except I wasn't alone. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. Figures shifting in the dark, circling me, whispering just out of reach. A voice slithered through the void. You carry a stolen soul. I turned, but there was no direction to face. She was promised to us. Lily. I looked down. She was still in my arms, her feverish skin burning against me. But something had changed. Her eyes were open. And she was staring past me into the dark. She wasn't afraid. She was listening. My stomach twisted. I didn't know where we were or what had pulled us from the church. But I knew one thing. They weren't finished with her. And they weren't finished with me. Then, from the darkness, hands, reaching, grabbing, dragging us down. The hands tightened around my arms, my legs, my throat, pulling me down into the abyss. I fought, kicked, struggled, but there were too many. The shadows wrapped around Lily, tendrils of blackness coiling over her small frame. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. I wouldn't let them take her. I wouldn't fail again. I forced my free hand upward, clutching my crucifix. She is not yours. The shadows screamed. A deafening, agonized wail that made my ears ring. The hands released me, retreating like smoke curling away from fire. And suddenly, I was falling again, plunging through the dark. The whispers faded. And then impact. I hit solid ground, the force knocking the air from my lungs. Lily cried out beside me, her small fingers clutching at my sleeve. She was still here. I gasped for breath, blinking against the dim light. We weren't in the void anymore. We were back in the church. But something was different. The pews were gone. The congregation was gone. The faceless priest stood alone at the altar, his head bowed. And then, slowly, he lifted his head. His face was no longer blank. He had a mouth now. And he was smiling. The priest smiled. It wasn't a human smile. His lips stretched too far, splitting the skin at the edges, revealing rows of blackened, jagged teeth. His newly formed eyes, dark pits that swallowed light, locked onto mine. Lily shivered in my arms. The air changed. The walls of the church pulsed like a living thing, shifting, breathing. Then, the priest spoke. You cannot steal from God. His voice was different now. No longer just in my head. It came from his mouth, thick and guttural, layered with voices that didn't belong to him. Lily whimpered. I took a step back, gripping my crucifix. She was never yours. The priest laughed. The church trembled. The candles lining the altar burst into flame, casting flickering shadows across the rotting walls. She always was. The room lurched. The floor split open beneath us. And I realized it. We were standing on the edge of something monstrous. A vast, gaping maw, its insides writhing, lined with bodies, half submerged in the blackness, their hands reaching, their faces frozen in agony. The church wasn't a building. It was a gate. A doorway into something worse than hell. And it was waiting for us to fall in. The priest lunged. I didn't think. I ran toward the fire. Toward the only way out. And then, everything erupted into flames. Fire consumed everything. The wooden beams of the church cracked and groaned, flames racing up the walls, turning the pulsing, living structure into an inferno. The priest stood in the center of the blaze, untouched by the fire. His smile never faded. Behind him, the gate yawned open, the abyss inside it writhing with souls trapped in endless torment. Lily clung to me, her body weak, her fever raging. Her mother, somewhere behind us, screamed. We had seconds before the church collapsed into the pit. Before we were swallowed whole. The priest raised one hand toward me. Give her back. The firelight made his unnatural grin stretch wider, his eyes filled with something far beyond madness. I had one chance. One final exorcism. I lifted my crucifix, took a shaking breath, and began to pray. The prayer burned my throat, but I forced the words out. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The priest hissed, his body twisting, bones cracking beneath his robe. The fire around us roared higher, but I kept going. I cast you out, unclean spirit, along with every satanic power of the enemy. Lily convulsed in my arms. She wasn't just burning up, something was fighting inside her. Her small hands clutched at my shirt, her fingernails digging into my skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lips mouthing words I couldn't hear. The priest took a step forward. His feet hovered above the burning floor, flames licking at his robe but never touching him. His smile never wavered. I tightened my grip on Lily, pushing everything I had into my prayer. Begone, in the name of Christ. The church shook. The walls split open, revealing the endless blackness beyond. And from the pit, something began to rise. A shape too vast, too monstrous for the human mind to comprehend. It was coming through the gate, and we were running out of time. The thing rising from the pit was beyond description. It had no true form, just an ever-shifting mass of limbs, faces, and writhing darkness. The souls trapped inside it screamed, their voices joining the infernal chorus. The priest fell to his knees, arms raised in worship. The fire raged, but it couldn't stop what was coming. I held Lily tighter, her tiny body shaking. Her lips trembled as if she were trying to speak, but the fever held her in its grip. I had to finish the rite. I raised the cross high. The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. The priest shrieked. His body convulsed, his skin cracking apart like porcelain. Darkness spilled from the wounds, writhing tendrils of pure evil, twisting toward me. I didn't stop. The power of Christ compels you. Lily let out a piercing cry. The darkness inside her burst forth, and the priest exploded into black ash. The thing in the pit let out an earth-shattering roar, the force of it shaking the entire world. The fire turned white-hot. And then, the church collapsed. I grabbed Lily's mother's hand. Run. We sprinted toward the exit as the roof caved in. The last thing I saw was the gate sealing shut, the monstrous entity dragged back inside, its rage echoing in the collapsing walls. And then, everything went white. Silence. For a moment, I thought I was dead. The white light had swallowed everything, and for a brief, terrifying second, there was nothing. No pain. No sound. No air. Then, I gasped, my lungs burning as I inhaled the scent of ash and earth. I was alive. The fire was gone. The church was gone. I was lying on my back in the middle of an empty field, the sky above me a dull, overcast gray. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of rain. Lily was beside me, her small body limp but breathing. Her fever was gone. Her mother knelt over her, sobbing with relief. I pushed myself up, my body aching. My hands were covered in soot and blood, my crucifix still clutched tight in my palm. We had escaped. But something felt wrong. The town was gone. The forest was gone. There was nothing but empty land, stretching in all directions. Lily's mother looked up, her face pale. Where are we? I didn't know. Then, Lily stirred. She opened her eyes. And she smiled. It's not over. A shadow passed overhead. And the whispering began again.